Welcome to Exploring Axon, a podcast where we discuss Axon Framework, Axon-Server, and their ecosystem. I am your host and the producer of this podcast, Sara. In this episode, I spoke with my colleague and one of Axon-Server's engineers, Stefan Dragisic, about our multi-tenant extension. We talked about what multi-tenancy is, why is it useful, and who should be considering using it. I hope you enjoy this episode, and let's have a listen. Hi, Stefan. Thank you so much for joining me today. Can you introduce yourself to everybody and tell everyone about your background and where you're located?
Hi, Sara. First of all, thank you for inviting me. Yes, my name is Stefan Dragisic, and I'm located in Belgrade, Serbia. I'm working as a software senior engineer in AxonIQ, and I worked for a lot of things in AxonIQ, from cloud, Axon-Server, Axon Framework. Basically, I'm all over the place. My background. So before AxonIQ, I was also working for one company where we implemented our own CQRS framework, where I saw all the drawbacks of doing such thing, how hard it is, and later AxonIQ found me. So it was really nice to join this company.
That's awesome. So prior to joining AxonIQ, which I think you've been with us for about 4 years, I think, 4 or 5 years, something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, very good. So you were already familiar with these concepts of CQRS, DDD, and things like that, and you had worked with it and obviously liked it enough to continue, which is great. And as you mentioned, you have been involved in a lot of the different projects and products as well, which kind of gives you a really nice overview of what everything is how everything is functioning together. And now, currently, I think you are more involved in the Axon-Server team, correct?
Yes, that's true. So
that's
we
where your
introduced
time
some
is.
organization. Yes, before
Yeah,
we were all around the place. So I think now we are focusing more in the team-based basically structure.
Exactly. So recently you did a really fantastic feature for Axon-Server, which is the tiered storage. And I had a conversation with Allard a little while ago about that, which was an amazing feature. But before that, you were focused on another part of, I think, both Axon Framework and Axon-Server feature, which turned out to be an extension, actually, which is great, which is what we're going to talk about today. And that is the multi-tenancy and multi-tenant extension that we have for the framework and server, right? I think you can use for both. Yeah, perfect. So tell me a little bit about what multi-tenancy is to begin with, and why is it useful?
Yeah. So first to start, basically, apparently, I like doing features with multi in its name. So multi-tenancy first, then the multi-tier storage. But to go back to the multi-tenancy. So basically, the tenancy is in the cloud computing is ability to host multiple customers or tenants. So in the shared infrastructure. So obviously, it's really easy to do that in the non-shared infrastructure, but in shared, there is a lot of things that we need to tackle, and most security, so that other users don't read other users' data, so they can read only their own data, so which is really important. So that's basically, in a simple terms, what the multi-tenancy is. But there are also a lot of different types of multi-tenancy. So I think every application that you work with, of course, supports multiple users. So it's in some way it's a multi-tenant application.
Right, fantastic. So it's very useful, obviously, for security purposes, and I'm assuming for also performance purposes. It makes things go a little bit faster and more performant. What kinds of, or what kind, maybe there's one kind of multi-tenancy does Axon support, and why did you choose this particular type as opposed to others? So can you tell me a little bit background about it and what got you to decide on that particular kind?
Yeah, so we identified 3 different types. So the most easier one to comprehend is if you have only one user and it uses only one application. So it's really easy. So you don't have this multi-user approach. You don't have any logging to distinguish other users from itself. And basically, this is one user, one application approach, which is really easy. So another more complex is that you have multiple users using one application and one CQRS application. That means that all of these users are going to have their events in one event store, and they're going to be basically together. Data will be going to be together, but it's going to be logically separate. So it's still physically together data, but logically you separate the users so they cannot access each own data. And so the third approach that we didn't have until this extension is that we want to have event store per each user, but we want them to share a single application. So we want to reduce some how we say so resources. So we want to reduce the number of resources that you use. Otherwise, you would need one application and per one user, which can be really expensive.
Yeah, perfect. So with the first approach that you mentioned, with the single tenant, like so each tenant uses their own event. So you decided basically we don't want to use this application. Was it just because of the cost purposes, or was it another reason why we decided to focus more on the basically shared users with different contexts?
Yeah. So there were some clients that were basically requesting, okay, we want to use Axon Framework, but we need the data for audit, and we need it physically separated because this is the policy, and we want it basically to be in different places. We don't want to mix them together, and we have a really strong GDPR policy. So we need to remove the data of the user once the user is gone. So until now, we basically just use cryptic erasure tool. You just crypt the data and throw the key, and you erased data basically. But it's going to be there, and you cannot remove it, which is one of the perks and the drawbacks of the event sourcing. So you have the data, which is great, but you have it forever, which is great and bad, depending how you want to keep it. And this approach enabled us basically to have data physically separated, and that you can also delete the data of the user. So sometimes the user basically is not on your platform anymore, and they request their data to be removed, and you just remove the whole event store of theirs, and that's it. So basically, you fix the event sourcing.
So then if you are deleting, and I think we're kind of veering off the conversation for just a moment, if that's okay, but if you are deleting these contexts, for instance, would you then want to event source them? Or is it for the times that you want to only store the data for a certain period of time and then get rid of it, which is kind of going to the conversation of tiered storage? But in this case, do you want to do event sourcing if you want to delete things?
Yes. So as I said, this really makes sense for, let's say, for accounting company. So you really need the audit of everything that happened, and you need it to be immutable. But so after some time, your user can request their data to be withdrawn from the platform, and you need to remove their data because of the compliance. It's not a silver bullet. It's really a purposely built tool to support these cases.
Okay, so now talking about the extension specifically, is it only for Axon-Server? And if so, why?
Yes. So the work that we have done was including Axon-Server, a little bit less because apparently Axon-Server did support multi-tenancy before, because you had option to do multiple contexts. But from the Axon framework side, you had to specify only one context. So yes, so the majority of the change was in Axon framework, and there were so much changes that we opted to just go with another extension, and it was not possible to include it in the Axon framework itself. So in the future, we might want to do that. So to have multi-tenant approach first. That we just saw that it's probably better like that. But probably better to support it at the beginning, and you can just use one tenant or multiple if you want. But right now, it's only an extension, and it's only for the Axon server. The reason is that multi-tenancy is really hard. So, and if you want to support it, everything that you use beneath all the other event bus, command bus, everything needs to support multi-tenancy too. So if you wanted to, for example, to use it without the Axon-Server, this is fine. We support some API that you can extend, and you can basically have it working. But if you want to use, for example, a MongoDB for event store, then you need to make sure that MongoDB supports multi-tenancy. If you want to use the JPA, you need JPA to support multi-tenancy, and they have really different API, how you provide who is the tenant and how to separate all this. Also, if you want a command bus to be in the J groups, or maybe you want to use Eureka, you need to make sure that your application can broadcast its capabilities, basically, which tenants it support and which doesn't. And then you need a software to manage all of the tenants, like which tenant is part of which application. So it goes really exponentially large. And if you want to support if you want to support all of these technologies, it's not only one extension. So it's basically a number of technologies, X number of combinations. So basically, you get xn extensions that we cannot support, and it's easier for us to support the Axon-Server only.
Yeah, gotcha. Makes sense. Now, as far as the version, at which version can folks use this extension?
Yeah, so it's supported since Axon Framework 4.6 and Axon-Server 0.46.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
So the I think the one before the latest Axon-Server release, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. A random question: is it backward compatible? I'm assuming not, because the API is changed and you can't really use it for the previous versions. And
before 4.6, no, you cannot use it. It's not backwards compatible.
Yeah, afterwards, but so okay, great. So why should anybody use this? I mean, we did talk a lot about the security and also some about performance, but why wouldn't everybody just use multi-tenancy extension and have their data separated? I know that a lot of times when folks ask about microservices, we tell them, don't go to microservices unless you really absolutely have to. Is it sort of the same kind of concept that we are approaching as well with multi-tenancy?
Yeah, exactly. So you're on the point, because multi-tenancy is really hard. It looks easy, and it gives you a great promise, like it fixes event sourcing. You have for each user, you have your own event store, and you can just delete the data whenever you want. And so it sounds easy, but it's not, because it has a price. So and the price is basically, if you wanted to do this with a multi-context, and then you have multiple applications, then you pay more for deploying all of these applications. So if you have 10 tenants, you need 10 applications for 10 contexts. Here we reduce this complexity a little bit. So we support then one application can handle 10 tenants. But this is probably the limit of the multi-tenancy extension, because all the infrastructure beneath is cloned. So it will use more resources. It will make a lot of connections to the database for all of these tenants, because these tenants are independent, and you don't want one fast tenant to basically slow down other tenants. That's why they are completely separate. And to have separated, we need to clone all of the infrastructure they're using. So it's not cheap, but it's still better than having 10 different applications for tenants. So it's up to you basically to manage how to organize the tenants per applications, and how many your applications can handle them. So if you have application that have thousands of clients, so the multi-tenancy is not for you. If you are, for example, accounting company that have 10 enterprise businesses, this makes perfect sense. And if you want to have shared trial, basically, plan, you can just put all of them in one application, and it's going to be really cheap for you. But if you have premium clients, you want to give them dedicated resources, you can do that. So you can just now move this tenant to be handled only by one application, and he has all the resources that it needs. So regarding the scalability and that, it's a really good approach to do.
I'm so glad that you mentioned this, because in the blog that you had written on this particular topic, which I will share in the podcast notes as well, so that everybody can go and check it out, you had a really good example of where the problem was and why you decided to approach it with the solution that you did. Can you talk about that example a little bit, where you have several different tenants and they want to reach the event store and, for instance, access their last 5 events or what have you, and then what kind of problem they're facing? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the problem are the tenants are living creatures, so one can be more active than others. So and how event store in Axon-Server works is basically that all events are put into the segments. The segments are basically the files where the events are, and there are multiple of them. So when you need the events, Axon-Server goes and finds the segments where the event is. And most likely that you are going to have to need multiple events, probably one close to each other, because that's how the time is ordered in the event store. So if you need event with the number 10, you probably will need also 9, 8, 7, and so on. The problem occurs if there is one really active tenant that is producing a lot of events. So, and for example, there's another tenant. Let's say you are another slower tenant, and you only log in from time to time, and you do few actions. You produce only few events. That means that for each month you do one action, so you produce one event, and I do something every day. That means that your events are going to be split in a lot of different segment files. So when you exactly, so when you come to the platform and you want to log in, Axon-Server needs to open now 10 different files instead of one file to retrieve all the events, which increase the latency. And this is, for example, really good for multi-tenancy if you don't want to have this problem, that basically you just have your tenant data in one context, and when the Axon-Server opens your context, it just opens one file and fetches all of your recent events that you need.
Perfect. And this makes sense because, as you mentioned, if you have a tenant that uses a lot of or produces a lot of events rather and stores them in the event store, then you are not going to be delayed if your events are not as quickly reproducible, so to speak. And this makes sense to really separate those event stores and separate those tenants as well. So that's fantastic. Now, how can you then actually, before I get to the scaling part of it, which you did talk about a little bit right now, do we have a limit on how many tenants can one application have?
Yes, as I said, it's not a serial bullet. And the main problem is it has a lot of connections open to your token store, for example, because you need tokens to know where you're left with consuming the events. And that's the limit, basically, that your database restricts you. In the future, maybe we'll be able to solve this, but right now it's not like a mathematical question that I can calculate. It depends on your resources, your database. We experimented with more than 10 tenants, and it worked fine. Assuming that not all of the tenants were active at the same moment, producing a large load. So I think it's best to just experiment and find what's the limit and when you need to split to more applications.
Gotcha. So it's basically per case and per resources. And you have to kind of do a trial and error and see what makes sense for your specific use case.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly.
So then we did talk a little bit about scalability, but can you explain a little bit more about how you can scale tenants and if you can have separate approach for premium tenants? You do explain a little bit about that on the blog as well, but can you go a little bit into detail on the scaling approach and how you can basically optimize for premium tenants and for the ones that use a lot of events?
So the great thing about the multi-tenancy is that it's changeable in the runtime. So you can attach new tenants in the runtime, create them, just move them to another application. pause them so they cannot use your platform, anything like that. And this enables us to basically just move tenants as we want. So you can have multiple applications in this multi-tenancy system that are handling the tenants. And you can say I want this one application to handle all of the free tenants, and you can just use a bunch of them in this one application, and it's probably going to be slower because of that. And you can have deployed multiple other applications that are standalone just for premium tenants. You just basically drag and drop them. So I say drag and drop them because you need to make this by yourself. We offer some really simple tenant management inside the Axon-Server, so the context management basically. But it's really easy to implement that by yourself. I did it for one company. I helped them basically with the proof of concept, how they can just scale the tenancy. And it was really easy. You just have one drag and drop panel and just move stuff like a kid can do it. And it's a great tool, basically. You're now scaling something that is really hard to do. And now you're just doing it with drag and drop. So there is a possibility for this.
Okay, great. A couple of questions on that. Do we have, so if somebody is using Axon-Server, obviously this is easy because Axon-Server automatically uses different contexts, and so you can use multi-tenancy for that. But if somebody is using the extension with Axon Framework, do we have code samples where they can go and check out how they can implement this in their projects?
Actually, yes, we have one repository named code samples.
Great.
Exactly, and there is a multi-tenancy project there that you can see and start. So it requires a license of Axon-Server because you need the enterprise edition. But luckily, we start offering free trial for Axon-Server, so you can download the license for free for 30 days in our website.
Which is perfect. Exactly. So I'll also include the repo for the code samples, and also put a link for the trial license so that everybody can go and play around with Axon-Server Enterprise for a month free of charge, or any kind of commitments for that matter. So finally, we did talk about how great this is, but also some of the challenges. You have to really plan for your project based on your needs to use multi-tenancy, because as you mentioned, there is a lot that is involved in terms of deployment and also planning ahead. It's not easy, and it's not a silver bullet, as you mentioned. But how would one know if multi-tenancy extension is the right one for their project, and if multi-tenancy in general is the right approach for them?
So I think there are a few signals that is easy to recognize. First, you really need the audit, and this is why you came for the event sourcing. The second, you need to be able to delete the data. Okay, there's another ways to do that, but let's say that you need to delete data and you don't have a lot of tenants. For example, you don't have a lot of clients that you need support, and for some reason you need to be compliant with the data being physically separate. So that means that probably you're doing with some sensitive data. If these things match, then probably the multi-tenancy is for you. So mostly your data needs to be separated. That's the main aspect. If you really need to have this data needs to be physically separated, then you need to look into multi-tenancy. Even if you have only 2 tenants, it's probably a good choice to do.
Yeah, makes sense. Fantastic. Any other points that you can think of that we didn't cover during our conversation that might be helpful to folks who are interested in using multi-tenancy?
Just first experiment with it. So it's, as I said, it's not easy, especially when you go into it. And so extension is kind of a magic because it does all of these things in the background, and it requires from you only a simple thing to do. You only need to provide a tag for initial message that comes to your system, which tenant is it, and that's it. So everybody then surprised how does it work, how it's too much magic. So especially when you have multi-bounded context, so you have 2 contexts and you need to have multiple tenants for this context. So data is flowing around and it's really hard to visualize it. Especially for the people who are new, especially who are new in event sourcing, Axon Framework, and then multi-tenants, it can be overwhelming. So it can really be overwhelming. And you really need first to onboard people and to understand how data is flowing, what is going where, and how multi-tenancy is going to take all of this hassle from you. Mm-hmm. You can also, there's a lot of auto configuration just to hide everything from you, but you can also basically configure it yourself if you really want to. Yeah. Some people do it just first to understand what is happening, and then they say, okay, now this is easy. I don't need it to be complicated, and they remove this their own configuration and stick with the defaults. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Yeah, that's a really great advice. I think it always is helpful, for me at least, to see how things are working before I get into the more magic way of doing things. It helps to see it and understand it first, and then say, okay, now I don't need to do all of the heavy lifting and all of the pipe work and so on. And now I can just use the extension and go from there. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stefan. And thank you so much for putting all this work into this extension and explaining to everybody what it is and how it works. I really appreciate the time. And hopefully we come back and talk a little bit more about tier storage or other features that you are working this year. So thanks again. I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Stefan, and I hope you give the multi-tenant extension a try and let us know what you think of it. Please join me next time for other amazing conversations with wonderful guests. Until then, have a great time and happy coding.